The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons at patreon.com/YumiCapri, and we want to say thank you to everyone for all of their support. And we want to thank all of our patrons, including our Capremium producers, Dallas Ford, Drew Agnew from the House of Mario podcast, Jace Baldridge from twitch.tv/Baka Ridge, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find him over at youtube.com/GamingPurpleMonkey. Our platinum producers, Brian Scott, Robbie Bobby Miller, and Trucker Sloth. And our gold members, Argo, Brennan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Fulia Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you so much for all of your support. Now, on with the show. Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 9th level of the RPG Cave. I am one of your hosts, the level 99 human Archmage, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 Elf Ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely Sunday? Of course, you know, we're going to let people behind the veil a little bit. We just recorded yesterday's episode, aka last week's episode. So we're recording these kind of back to back. So not too much time has passed since the last episode. But how are you anyways, Garret?
I am doing fantastic. I'm ready to get into this franchise. I've dabbled in only as of recent, really. But yeah, I'm ready to get into it, ready to talk some RPGs.
Very nice, my friend. Of course, before we talk about today's series, we should probably clear the dungeon a little bit of these pesky mobs. Of course, if you like what we do and you want to support the show, of course, you can support us for free over on your podcast service of choice. Just, you know, subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. Leave us a little review, maybe, if you want to do that. If you leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, for example, we will read it on the show. Again, we don't have any to read this week because we didn't have any to read yesterday when we recorded last week's episode. But, you know, if one comes in, we will read that here in this segment. If you have bucks to toss and you feel inclined to do so as well, patreon.com/YumiCapri is where you could do that. Of course, you get early access to this show as well as exclusive content, including a bonus podcast we put out called Yumi Capri, which Sean and I actually just recorded yesterday, but that was last week by the time you're listening to this. But that's up there, as well as we do like a podcast called the Pates Patreon podcast, which is like an AMA podcast with Sean. So we have those exclusively on Patreon, but as well, you can get the show a day early as well as all of our other content a day early as well. So you can check us out there, patreon.com/YumiCapri for more details. All right, Garret, let's read from the sacred text and talk about Monster Hunter. Now, before I get into my usual quick facts, because obviously everyone knows we've done a couple of these series ones now, Garret. So people know I love hitting you with the quick facts. But before we get into that, we should preface something, because this is probably the first time we've done a series that neither of us are like too hardcore about. Like, I know, Garret, you've really
we're not huge fans.
Yeah, I know you've really gotten to this recently. More so than me. But I am not as huge of a fan of the baseline Monster Hunter games, but I am getting more into the series because of the side series, Monster Hunter Stories, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And we kind of wanted to do this one as well to kind of celebrate the release of Monster Hunter Stories 2, which just came out. So we wanted to kind of talk about that here, as well as talk about the main series and kind of what our thoughts are about just Monster Hunter as a whole. So just keep in mind, you know, we're not super knowledgeable about Monster Hunter. There's a chance we might get some stuff wrong too. Just be nice to us. You know, I mean, we're doing our best here. And again, I think
I'm sorry for the Monster Hunter fans.
Yeah, but more so, I think
the Monster Hunter fans out there.
Yeah, but more so, I think we're just, you know, we're just new people trying to get into the series for the first time as well. Which again, I think is a valuable opinion to have as well, because you know, not everyone needs to be an expert about stuff to have like opinions both positive and negative about stuff. So just keep that in mind. But now let me hit you with some quick facts about the series. Of course, the original Monster Hunter released back in the day on PS2 in Japan on March 11th, 2004, and in North America later that year on September 12th, 2004. Then Monster Hunter 2 was released in Japan only on February 16th, 2006. It eventually came to North America in the form of Monster Hunter Freedom 2 on the PSP on August 28th, 2007. We'll get to the Monster Hunter Freedom games in a little bit. Monster Hunter Tri, the next game in the series, was released on the Wii on August 1st, 2009, and in North America the next year on April 20th, 2010. And then Monster Hunter 4 was released on 3DS on September 14th, 2013, and came to North America for the first time on February 13th, 2015. That's quite a gap. And it was like the ultimate version of that game rather than just the base version. We never actually got the base version of Monster Hunter 4. And then Monster Hunter World was the very first game in the entire series to receive a worldwide release on January 26, 2018 on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. And then the newest game in the baseline series, Monster Hunter Rise, launched earlier this year on Switch on March 26, 2021. And of course, with the release of Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin a couple weeks ago from the time you're listening to this, there are now 19 total games in the Monster Hunter series, including spin-offs, remakes, remasters, what have you. The series itself was originally designed as like part of this big three kind of group over at Capcom, where they essentially had three titles that wanted to take advantage of the PS2's online capabilities, because this was around the time that the network adapter was about to come out. So Capcom wanted to have three games kind of out the same year, because the online adapter also came out the same year in 2004. So they wanted to have three games out to basically celebrate the launch, but also their goal was to basically sell at least 1 million copies of one of these three games. And of course, the big three in question were Auto Modelista, which was a racing game, Resident Evil Outbreak, which was the very first Resident Evil online multiplayer game, and then Monster Hunter. And surprisingly to Capcom, both Resident Evil and Monster Hunter both sold 1 million copies in Japan specifically, which for Japan in particular, those are actually pretty big numbers for a game to sell 1 million in Japan. It doesn't happen too often, at least, especially back during this time period.
For sure.
Also, the Monster Hunter series was, heavily PSP focused and Sony focused, and it wasn't really until the PSP discontinued where they kind of fully went in with Nintendo, because they really had to decide where to put the future of these games, whether it was on Vita or 3DS, but they decided to go with 3DS due to the series being much more popular in Japan on Nintendo consoles, but also the 3DS is just larger in style base in general. And then, of course, last year, Garrett, we got the very first Monster Hunter movie starring Mila Jovovich. I wanted to bring that up because I forgot to bring up the Witcher TV series when we talked about the Witcher last week.
That's true.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure to mention that there is a Monster Hunter movie if you want to go watch it. Please don't watch the Monster Hunter movie.
Don't watch it.
So, of course, as always with these series episodes, Garrett, I'm going to ask you the same question I always ask you first. How did you get into Monster Hunter as a series? Like, what was the first game you played?
Okay, so the first game I played really was was it Monster Hunter 3? It was Gen 3 or something like that on the 3DS. Okay. That was like my earliest game that I know of the franchise. I never played any Monster Hunter before. I haven't played Monster Hunter on the on the main consoles, home consoles or whatever. And I was like getting into it because I know a lot of people really enjoyed the series. Like the people who are into this series are really, really into this. Like these are fans that probably play only this game, maybe sprinkle in here and there in other games, hundreds of hours into this game. It's like nonstop, the grind. So for me, it was that game. And I didn't really get into it just because the controls on the 3DS it's not the best in the world. Yeah. Let me tell you. I actually had it before the new 3DS. So I had the 3DS XL. It didn't have a C-stick or anything like that, right? It didn't have that second camera control angle view or whatever. You could do two things. One, you can just use the face buttons on the right, and then you have to press the trigger in order to trigger your other buttons to be a different button layout or whatever. Or you can have an extension on your 3DS. And I know a lot of Monster Hunter fans had this extension so they can have a second stick to go all the way around with that 3DS game.
The Circle Pad Pro,
that
extension you're referring to, by the way.
Yes.
It was useful for like that, Resident Evil Resolutions, and then like Kid Icarus Uprising were like the 3 games you actually used it for, essentially.
Exactly. So that was my first experience with it. I only played like maybe 2 to 3 hours before I was like, this is kind of boring. This is like, I don't know. It didn't really interest me. It was kind of slow. It's kind of hard to get into, I think. It is a steep learning curve. Jump to like today. I'm really more into, I played a lot of Monster Hunter World. Mm-hmm. And then I played actually a lot of Monster Hunter Rise, not hundreds of hours per se, but I've definitely put in more time than what I did in the 3DS. And I really dig and understand the grind now. Mm-hmm. I love going out into hunts and trying to get the materials I need from the big monsters. I choose different classes, right? It's a third-person action RPG. You go through different classes and everything, and you just grab all the things that you can from these monsters, and you craft some more, and then that's the grind right there with these mainline series. You just go over and over and over again, and people really enjoy it. I understand it now more than ever. Like, it's really cool to just go back to this game, and it doesn't feel like I'm out of touch or anything. Maybe sometimes in the Monster Hunter world, but in Monster Hunter Rise, it's very easy to pick up and do a couple of hunts here and there just to get back into it. So yeah, I'm really enjoying what I'm playing so far in Rise.
Very nice, my friend. My history with Monster Hunter goes much farther back, because I actually played Monster Hunter on PlayStation 2, believe it or not, and it was a very clunky experience. It was not super enjoyable, anyways. Especially if you go back and play it today, like it's very silly. The one thing to note about Monster Hunter that I didn't mention before is that all of the games, even though they do have the ability to be played single player, they are always primarily multiplayer focused, and they're very much about getting your friends together and playing, especially again knowing the history of the series and how they wanted it to be a big online title. Like, it's very much like most of the Monster Hunter gameplay is very much rooted in online multiplayer, and this is one of those things where, like, back in the day, I was like dead set on trying to play this game just on PS2 by myself, rather than playing with people, because I don't know if you ever tried to play PS2 games online back in the day, Garrett, but it was never a good experience because it was all dial-up only, essentially, because there was no like Ethernet connection. So like the connection, you would just have tons of lag or just all kinds of systemic issues that really did not make online multiplayer being a very fun experience. So it was really tough to play that game back in the day. But I continued on with the series. The next iteration I picked up was actually Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii. Because I remember that actually being, pretty appealing playing that on the Wii. And it actually played much better than the PS2 version, but I still ran into kind of the same problem because, again, for anyone who tried to play online games on the Wii, it's same kind of issues you kind of ran into, especially because there was no Ethernet port on the console, so it was just Wi-Fi only, which again led to its own set of problems. So then the next one I really picked up on after that was Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on the 3DS, because that was when the new Nintendo 3DS came out. And there was actually a launch bundle for that actually came with a Monster Hunter Special Edition 3DS that actually came with the game, as well as the Monster Hunter themed console, which was awesome. Like it looked really awesome to have in person.
It looks so good.
Yeah, and it actually is quite valuable now if you actually still have one. So that's where I jumped back in the series. I was like, okay, this version's actually pretty fun, and it was a lot better to play this version on 3DS versus your experience before, because you actually had the analog nub on the console, so it just made it way easier to play. Like it's actually kind of weird in general that the series went down like this portable route, because it was a third-person action RPG with like manual camera controls, and it was so hard to do on PSP or 3DS before the new Nintendo 3DS came out. Like it's weird that it even got to that point, because even controlling the camera on the PSP was very unwieldy too, for the same reason. Like you had to the right analog stick was essentially mapped to the sacred symbols like the triangle, X, square, and cross buttons. So it was so weird to control portably. But I kind of just fell off the series after that. Because with Monster Hunter World came out, I bought it when it was on sale, and I barely played it. Like I played maybe an hour or two of it and never went back. And then then Monster Hunter Rise, I just never picked up on Switch. So I've never played that version. And it wasn't really until Monster Hunter Stories 2 came out that I was like kind of all in going back on Monster Hunter. Like, yes, this is kind of the experience I really wanted from Monster Hunter. Like a really tight experience with great visuals and a cool story. Which again, the Monster Hunter games never really known for the story either. So like that's
never.
Like it really is, other than the story games, which again, it's got stories in the title, so you expect there to be a good story in those games. But it's just funny to look back on it, where it's like it's very much all about, hunting monsters. Like it's like the everything you do in that game is basically told to you in the title of that game. You hunt monsters. Yeah. That's it. That's the whole point of the game. So obviously, Garrett, where should people start with this series? Now that I think you're probably the bigger Monster Hunter fan of the two of us, so I'm going to ask you this question. Yeah. Where should people start with Monster Hunter? Is there a particular game that they should start with?
That's a good question, I think. If you prefer playing on your Switch a lot, if you want to just play video games on the Switch and nowhere else, Monster Hunter Rise is probably the best game in the franchise and most accessible to people ever before. It's still Monster Hunter, where you go through several hunts, you go and do a specific monster, and you go out into the certain area, and then you try to track the monster down. You go through the Monster Hunter loop, definitely. But what I love about Monster Hunter Rise is that there's a lot of quality of life updates from both borrowed from handheld games and also from Monster Hunter World. Mainly, actually, one of them is, one of the new additions to the game is the wire bugs, the fly bugs, and it's very versatile now. Whereas I feel like previous Monster Hunter games, once you die in a hunt, you go all the way back to the beginning of the hunt, and you're like, oh gosh, I'm gonna have to go all the way back to the monster and see if I can beat them in time. In Monster Hunter Rise, there's a lot of there's this wire bug, and it's two wire bugs at a time, or maybe three, where you literally just traverse like an acrobat, like Spider-Man, where you just fly up into the sky. You can go up cliffs pretty easily with it. And then you also have your companion, if you choose to do so, the dog Palamute. You can ride on Palamute, and he goes pretty fast too. And then the last thing is you could teleport anywhere really around the map if you explore it enough. So there's a lot of versatility in Monster Hunter Rise that makes the hunts much quicker to get into the action, and mechanically it's really good. It's not as in-depth as Monster Hunter World in terms of skills and combat of each of the weapons, but it does have its own set of skills that's unique for sure, and especially with the wire bugs as well. So yeah, I would recommend Monster Hunter Rise. For Switch.
Sounds like it's the most user-friendly one to get into. If you're someone who's brand new, I'm with you. I think Rise is probably the best place to start. I mean, you could say World because I think it still has a really dedicated community and it's very easy to find games or find people to play with. Probably easier to maybe find people. Well, maybe not anyways, because Rise I think is sold pretty well on Switch. So, and I think a lot of people are still playing it. But either way, I think you probably it just depends on what console it comes down to that you want to play on too. Because obviously, if you don't have a Switch or if you don't want to play portably, World might be your best option. I was going to say that you could play it on Game Pass, but it has since left Game Pass, so you won't actually be able to play it on Game Pass.
It did leave Game Pass.
It was just last month too, of course, so, with the timing of things. So,
of course,
normally I would say just play it on Game Pass, but you don't have that option now. So, I mean, it depends on what console, but Garrett's probably right. Rise is probably the best place to start if you want to. I would not recommend
and it's very stable.
Which is good.
it's very stable, like 30 frames, and it doesn't dip below that. It's surprisingly performs really well.
Plus, the online I hear is pretty good in it too.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is not always, which is always hit and miss
Yes.
on Switch games. I find so.
Mm-hmm.
Which is awesome to know. I would not recommend going back to the older Monster Hunter games, like the 3DS games, PSP games, even the PS2 ones. Like, especially too, like the older games, a lot of their servers have been turned off, so you can't play with other people. And the games themselves, since they're designed around playing with other people, are just so much harder and more frustrating to play if you don't have other people to play with. So, unless you really need to see
true.
kind of like the origins of the series and feel like you need to play the original games for some reason, just don't. Just play the newest games in the Monster Hunter series. I think that's good. Although the one I will say to go back to that I think is okay to go back to is obviously Monster Hunter Stories, which we'll talk about a little bit, like the 3DS game. Obviously, is okay to go back to.
Yes. I think I want to say one more thing about like which game to play is like Rise for sure first if you're a new fan, and then once you become a fan, there's not like there's a lot of monsters on Rise, but not all the monsters. Monster Hunter Gen Ultimate on the Switch is a port from the Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on 3DS. And that set of monsters is like literally all monsters that's been like there in previously. So if you really get into the game, into Rise, and you think like your Monster Hunter Rised out, then you can definitely go back to Gen Ult, and it still plays pretty well on
Yeah,
Switch.
exactly. Not only that, but again, there's still probably people playing it and stuff like that too. And again, it's right there on Switch, so it's on a modern console. It's not like you're going back to the 3DS, nub or the PSP awkward controls and stuff like that. So there you go. So that's where we should start. But I wanted to now bring in Mike at Blaze Knight 0923, and he asked a question about Monster Hunter. I've only played the first Monster Hunter back on PS2 personally. What changes have kept the series fresh for all of these years? It seems like the formula would burn out pretty quickly. So, Mike, I'm glad you asked this question because kind of going back to something Garrett kind of talked about when kind of describing the difference between World and Rise, honestly, the formula from Monster Hunter hasn't changed in a dramatic way since the very first game on PS2.
No, it hasn't.
Again, as I kind of alluded to, you hunt monsters. That's what you do. It's in the title. That's what you do in this game. And that formula has pretty much been there throughout the entire series. So obviously this kind of leads us into mechanics and what makes Monster Hunter unique. So as a monster hunter, what the main kind of goal of the game obviously is to hunt monsters. So what you need to do obviously is if you're hunting a specific monster, you have to kind of investigate a little bit to kind of find out where the monster is, and then you go kill it. And then you kind of have to figure out its weaknesses from there. And because there's a bunch of different weapons, for example, in Monster Hunter that have different strengths and weaknesses, and those will do better or worse against certain monsters. So you kind of have to know what equipment set to kind of bring with you to tackle each monster. It actually plays a lot into what we talked about last week with The Witcher in a lot of ways, Garrett, where you kind of have to plan things out ahead of time.
Definitely.
And you have to be a little more strategic with what you do. But I wanted to ask you, of course, going back to Mike's question, obviously, besides some of the things you just touched on with Rise, what other changes have you really noticed over time with the Monster Hunter series? As far as mechanics are concerned.
Right. I haven't played the Monster Hunter on PS2, but I'm sure like nowadays the quality of life updates on just pretty much everything has been lifted quite a bit in these recent games. I think it's much easier to get into in terms of menus. I'm sure the tutorials is much easier. And I think actually the combat itself is a lot less clunky and more action-based. And I think it's really easy to play. To be honest with you, Rise, like if I choose the right weapons and like go for easy monsters, like it's like, oh, this is like much easier than I thought. And then you can like rack up the difficulty if you want. I think they have new weapons and new combat techniques in those weapons that makes it really fulfilling. And you can get really deep into these weapons. Like one of them is like the gun lance, where like you have a certain amount of movesets to switch between gun and the lance, and like the combat between that is like between like a short range and then combat itself, and you can do insane combos to really weaken a monster. So other than like the depthness of the weapons, probably the versatility, of course, on Monster Hunter Rise. And then just simple quality of life updates. There's really not much more, again, dramatic on the formula. There's one mode in Monster Hunter Rise that's kind of like a tower defense game. I think it's fine. It's not like the best in the world, but it's a cool sprinkled in mode where you don't have to like do this over and over again, Monster Hunter type of thing, where this defense tower, there's a bunch of monsters coming in and you set up little turrets and towers or whatnot, and you can man those towers if you want. You can make them automatic, whatever, or you can just attack the monsters during the waves. But it gets very chaotic compared to a standard hunt where you kind of predict the moves of one monster. This one, it's like a bunch of monsters coming in. You're like, all right, I'm going to have to figure out how to manage all of this. It's a little chaotic, but it is still a lot of fun and very different than what you see in previous Monster Hunter games.
Yeah, and I can attribute to what you were talking about as far as the combat is concerned, because the combat in the original Monster Hunter, for example, is like super slow and clunky. Like, imagine what I talked about with Dark Souls, where it's very like slow and heavy, but then crank that up to like an even further degree where it feels like even slower and heavier. While also just whenever your character gets hit, they make like this really goofy motion. So it's like it's trying to be this kind of arcade experience, but it's also just like it's just so slow to play that it's just not really fun, especially to go back to. And the one of course the quality of life things that I wish they would improve obviously was kind of the checkpoint system, or at least including kind of a checkpoint system. Like you said, if you kind of lose on, one of the hunts, you're kind of going back pretty far. Like even with some of the newer games, it's not as bad on as with the PS2 one, where essentially you basically have to start over again.
Oh goodness.
It's still pretty punishing anyways, which is why, again, it wants you to maybe learn a little bit quickly, get good, as the kids might say, to kind of
pretty much,
figure out what to do. But again, other than that, like the base mechanics from start to finish are pretty much unchanged. Again, you pretty much investigate the monster and you go kill it. That's pretty much what you do, and you get a whole bunch of players together and kill the bigger monsters. That's just what you do essentially. It reminds me a lot of like an offline MMO in a lot of ways, or like a smaller, more condensed MMO. Yeah. Because like most of the party combat just feels very similar to like some of the like trials, for example, in Final Fantasy 14, just on a much like more condensed scale, I think. So yeah, that as far as mechanics are concerned, they haven't really evolved too much. And again, as far as story, there's not much to tell. Again, you're a monster hunter.
The story is very flat.
Kill them
always.
Yeah. For the most part, you just go out there and kill the monsters and you have a good time with your friends, essentially. But segueing from that, Garrett, we should talk about Monster Hunter Stories, of course, because I think both you and I are probably a little more familiar with this series as well. Of course, Monster Hunter Stories started all out on the 3DS. And it was essentially a turn-based JRPG that also was taking place in the Monster Hunter universe. And again, we just got a sequel again a couple weeks ago from the time you are listening to this, or again a couple days ago for me and Garrett at the time we're recording this. And I know you and I were both really excited for this game coming out, because I know, Garrett, you played the first game, but I missed out on it. So tell me real quick about the first Monster Hunter Stories and maybe how it's a little bit different from the new one.
Oh, definitely. So Monster Hunter Stories is a spin-off turn-based RPG about these class of people called the Riders. And these riders are actually friends of the monsters, and you kind of like capture them kind of like Pokemon, and they're like on your side. And so you, as the rider, can choose like a weapon in class or whatever, and then you'll have your monster on your side. And there's the kind of this like dual partnership turn-based combat against the monsters in battle. So that's like the basics of Monster Hunter Stories. It has a very good story. I think the Monster Hunter Stories, like the first story, is like they were just trying to test out like this game, see if it would become really popular in terms of the mechanics itself. The story is not like that grand, I would say. The characters were kind of just mid-tier. Like the animation style was very blank too. It just had this blank face and like just moving the mouth or whatever. So it didn't have much character to it. But what I've played with Monster Hunter Stories too, much deeper into the story, which I'm very excited about. I think one of the biggest things in this game is it is a little bit more dungeon crawling, where you go out into the area and then you hit certain monsters and you get into combat. But once you beat a certain monster, you have a chance that that monster goes into its own den, and then you go into that den, and that's a mini dungeon in itself. And then once you go all the way to the end, you'll go to its nest. And then you actually grab an egg from that nest and come all the way back out, and that becomes your monster, basically. And then what's very unique about this turn-based combat versus Pokemon, per se, is that it's not, I mean, there are some elements involved, but mainly there's like this kind of this triangle combat-based in the combat. It's like basically there's technical attack, power attack, and speed attack, and one beats the other, and you're gonna have to predict which one the monsters is kind of choosing, and you have to recognize the patterns. You have to recognize what monster it is too, in order to figure out what's best against that enemy. So overall, I think it's a very unique take on the turn-based JRPG formula. And I'm really glad that they're making this, and I'm really glad that they're doubling down on Monster Hunter Stories too as well. It's a very good sets of games to get into, for sure.
Yeah, like I've only really played the first 4 hours, which is the demo, and really enjoyed what I played of it. Like I loved kind of the alternate take of that Stories 2 or even the first Stories has, where again, like almost like the monster hunters that you play in the other games are almost like the bad guys in a lot of ways, where they're going out and killing your friends essentially, and whereas you're just trying to protect them. Even though again, when you go to a monster's den, you kind of kill the monster and then steal its baby a lot of times. Like I don't know. In a lot of ways, the morality of the Monster Hunter world, Garrett, is very questionable, regardless of what side you're on. But sure. I really loved like collecting the different monsters around kind of the first area you are in that game, and I liked too the combat system that you talked about. Like it's almost like a rock paper scissors system, similar to like a fighting game in a lot of ways, where like the speed attack beats the power attack, but it loses to the technical attacks, and then you're just like. You kind of like figure out in this giant triangle, like, and have to kind of predict what the other monster is going to do, like you talked about. But it also, again, I think that's really true to what we talked about with the Monster Hunter mainline series as well, where again, you need to learn about these monsters as you go into them, so that you know kind of the best tactics for taking them down. And that really plays into the gameplay of Stories as well, which I really enjoyed. Again, it's very unique, like you said, from a lot of other role-playing games. Like, again, there aren't really other ones with like a turn-based system that's like this in a lot of ways, where it's like, again, this like rock, paper, scissors kind of thing. For the most part, you're just picking your attacks, and then obviously if they have like elemental weaknesses, you're going with that. But otherwise, in this game, it was really unique. Also, I really like how they brought in how the different weapons work in this game as well, because obviously, in addition to the kind of the triangle system, you've also got all of your weapon sets from the Monster Hunter baseline games, and they'll be either weaker or stronger against certain enemies as well. And again, a lot of that plays into again the weaknesses and strengths that they have from the baseline games as well. So I love how they ported that all over and kind of made sure that's part of this experience too, even though it is like a turn-based experience. I thought all of that was really neat, and just I just really like the combat overall in this game.
It's refreshing in a turn-based combat. One thing I do want to mention, and it's in both in the mainline games and in Monster Hunter Stories, is actually getting the parts from the monsters themselves. And so what a lot of people really want to do is take out like a certain tail or like a body shell or whatever to get certain materials. And then in the mainline Monster Hunter games, you go back to your hut, and then like I think the part of the grind that I really enjoy in that game is actually making the weapons and making the armor sets from the game, and getting the matched armor sets, the matched weapon sets, and making them stronger. And in order to do that, you're going to have to go back out into the hunt and hunt like probably the same monster multiple times to get certain parts from that. Same thing in Monster Hunter Stories too, as you said, with the different weapon types. In the second game, you have a choice of different parts of the monster sometimes. So you can like hit the tail, you can hit the head or whatever. And then sometimes you need a blunt weapon or you need a ranged weapon in order to knock that one down in order to get that part. So I think that granular mechanic in there makes it pretty addicting and lifelong in both sets of these games, for sure.
Yeah, and there's definitely a reason to target the parts of the enemy too, because like they'll the monster will have like unique attacks, for example, for that part.
Yeah.
Like the tail sometimes might shoot poison or might do like a tail whip or something like that, and you've got to like target the tail, or you target its face to kind of knock it out. Like there's a bunch of different reasons why you kind of target those parts, and it also again just encourages you to play with kind of the weapon wheel and maybe just not stick with one weapon throughout the entire experience, which again I think is just really, really cool and kind of refreshing when you compare it to other RPGs out there. Of course, it's not a perfect game either, because obviously, we're playing this game on Switch, Garrett, and it's 2021, and we kind of need a Switch Pro like right now, like the clock's ticking, because this game performance-wise doesn't run super well. Unlike what we talked about with Rise. Earlier in our discussion, this game in particular doesn't run super well on Switch, which is just too bad because it visually looks really impressive. It's just, I just wish, the frame rate could keep up with things. So.
The second village in Monster Hunter Stories 2, no joke, man. I feel like I am in like a 2002 or late 90s MMO. Just like, it's just screeching the frames in that village. And I'm like, come on, this looks like like a late GameCube game or something. It's just, I'm tired of it. I want a Switch Pro. Definitely.
Now, the real question is, are you playing the game handheld mode or on the TV, Garrett?
I'm mainly playing on handheld mode. Sometimes I play on TV mode, but I feel like either or, you're still getting that frame.
I was just going to say, because you saying that really scares me, because I remember playing the demo on TV, on my TV, and seeing it just ran performance-wise like really terribly. And then when I played it in handheld mode, it was noticeably better. So I found it was running better on handheld mode. So I can't even imagine going to that second city that you're describing on TV mode and seeing what that's like. It probably runs at like 20 frames per second or something like that. Which is,
it's so much worse than Breath of the Wild in that forest. It's pretty bad in there. So
yeah, but lo and behold, though, I think we both really like that game as well. Like that's, in a lot of ways, Monster Hunter Stories 2, the main reason I wanted to touch on it so much as well was just, this is kind of the game that kind of brought us together on Monster Hunter, because I know, Garrett, again, you're newer to the Monster Hunter series, but you've been enjoying it much more than me, especially with the newer games. And then with me, I'm someone who fell off with Monster Hunter, but we both commonly came together and realized, well, we both like the same game in the series for the first time like ever. So I thought it was really cool for us to maybe talk about that as well. So
for sure.
I love it there. So definitely, if you're new to the Monster Hunter series as well, again, we talked about it with Rise, maybe kind of being the entry point, but maybe you could make the argument that maybe this is kind of the way you get into it. Maybe with stories, especially if you're looking for more of a turn-based experience rather than, an action RPG, especially too, because you don't have to worry about playing with other people with this one too, because it's single player only versus the mainline games. So I would definitely maybe recommend this one for anyone new as well, if you didn't want to pick up Rise as well. Which again, nice thing is too, there's a very lengthy demo for this, and your progress carries over. So there's no reason to at least try it if you are brand new. Which I think this is probably the only modern demo we have for Monster Hunter. I think, because we have a demo for Monster Hunter 4 on 3DS, but I don't think we have like a demo for Rise on Switch or anything like that. I think there was a trial before it came out.
There was a trial,
I don't think there's a current demo
for Rise, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of how we feel about Monster Hunter. But of course, Garrett, what's your favorite game in the Monster Hunter series? I had to ask you right now, what's your favorite game?
I mean, Monster Hunter Stories 2 could just take everything, to be honest with you. The amount of time. Like right now, I think yesterday I tweeted out, I was like, this might replace my game of the year currently for this year, just because even though there's a huge performance hitch on Switch, the combat's so good. It's very solid, and the story is intriguing to me. But for now, I'm going to say my favorite game is Monster Hunter Rise. And it's just because of that addicting nature of going out into the hunt, grabbing your materials, and then coming back and then making all that you can. The multiplayer is so solid in that game. You can't say that for any other Switch game, really. It is probably the most solid Switch experience I've ever had, other than Splatoon 2. And then other than that, yeah, Rise is just a very solid mainline series game that I implore people, if they want to get into this series, that's the game to go to. So I would say Monster Hunter Rise is my favorite game so far.
Nice. And yeah, the fact that we're willing to put up with, the terrible frame rates for Monster Hunter Stories and still are having a good time with it just tells you just how good of a game it is. So yeah, I would say that it's up there, but obviously, again, I haven't played the full game, so I can't justify actually saying it's my favorite, Garrett. So I'm going to go with the game I spent the most time with and had the most time enjoying before it, and that's Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on 3DS. Like, I played that game a ton, and I actually really liked it. And again, it's a shame that I kind of fell off the series beyond that. But Monster Hunter 4, I think, was actually a surprisingly fun game on 3DS. Again, it actually leveraged the power of the new Nintendo 3DS in ways that maybe no other game did. Like, because we talked about Xenoblade Chronicles on the last episode, where it just didn't run well. But that's a game that Monster Hunter 4, I think, really took advantage of the new Nintendo 3DS's power in a way that a lot of other games didn't, as far as both in kind of the load times, but also the performance as well. And again, the analog stick, like the analog nub, anyways, I should say, just makes it so much easier to control that versus the other Monster Hunter games on 3DS. So that's my favorite of the games I've played. But again, like you, Stories 2 is probably going to become my favorite game in the series, by default almost, by the time I actually start playing it and finishing it. Because I was supposed to actually have it by the time we had this recording, but my order actually ended up getting canceled, and I just haven't gone out and got a copy of it yet. But I'll have it probably in the next week or so. So there you go. But before we move on from Monster Hunter, Garrett, we got two questions. Both from the most famous of all Seumas's, Mr. Seumas MacIsaac at Famous Seumas. He asked two questions. So first question, what are your favorite monsters from the Monster Hunter series? So obviously, to give you a bit of time to think about this, Garrett, I have a very boring answer for this. And it's Rathlos. And the reason I like Rathlos the most is I really, really like dragons. I like dragons a lot. Not to like an awful degree, but I really like dragons, both in video games and movies and anime and stuff like that, or even just card games. Like I build like specific card game decks for Magic the Gathering that are just based about dragons because I like dragons so much. So obviously Rathlos being kind of the dragon equivalent by default, and he's kind of like the face dragon for the Monster Hunter series. I think that's why I like Rathlos the most, is because I like dragons. Cool. Rathlos is a dragon. I mean, other than in name only. And I think, he's probably my favorite. But what about you, Garrett? Do you have a favorite monster in the Monster Hunter series?
So it would be mainly in the Monster Hunter Rise series. One that really stuck out to me, and it was a new monster. And it's not your typical monster that you see a lot. It's not a dragon. It's not like any type of like that. And it's a monster called, I think, Gos Herog, yes. And so this dude, he looks like an abominable snowman, and his like favorite technique to do is like change his arm into an icicle arm and just slash people like crazy. And I've seen so many videos on Twitter now where this dude destroys people. Like, it doesn't, like, no chance for them to get up. It was like one attack, and there's like, no, you're not getting up, and just smashes them with the icicle. It looks really cool. So I have to give it out to Gos Herog. I also want to shout out Magnamalo, who is the title screen monster in the Monster Hunter series. Such a cool design of a monster. Kind of like like a demigod of some kind, of a mixture of things. And like, I love the dark aura that surrounds him too. And playing against him is so rough because he's so big and so strong, but he's so fast too. You got to be very careful when playing against him, because he'll just knock you out in like 10 seconds if you give him a chance. So for sure, both of those monsters were among my favorite in the series.
Very nice. Well, Seumas had another question for us, as I alluded to. If you could have any of the dishes from Monster Hunter World in real life, what would you have? So I love this one. It's an interesting question, but the problem is, Garrett, as we kind of alluded to, neither of us really played a ton of Monster Hunter World. Like, you definitely played more than me, but it was like,
yeah.
I don't know how memorable really the food was from Monster Hunter World, anyways. In particular, I guess sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it's normally like one dish that they make in the game, and like, of course, there's different options and everything on the menu. But normally, when you look at it in like the cutscenes and everything, it's that one dish. And actually, the Monster Hunter World dish looks so good. It's like all the meats, and I think it's like mainly meats that cooking up by the cats and the meow. You know, we didn't mention about the meowsters. That's probably the one component of Monster Hunter that's pretty funny is these meowcenaries, and they're cooks, and they're also your companions as well. For a long time, they just added dogs into the Monster Hunter series, and I think it adds a good comical relief to the game. It's not super dark all the time. It's not like Dark Souls. It's very light. It's very comical. And you got these cat puns and dog puns now all the time. But yeah, the dish in Monster Hunter World, look up on YouTube, Monster Hunter World cat meat dish cutscene, because that made me drool. No joke. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to eat all of that.
Because again, from what and this is kind of why I was like, wait a second, where do we go from this? Like, because I remember when I was playing Monster Hunter World, like I only remember like you said, there was only like one dish that it kind of shows you. Like you made multiple dishes in that game. Like you can make like a fish platter or like the chef's choice platter or the meat platter. But then they kind of all look similar. So it's just like, well,
yes.
Which one of these is most appetizing? And I think the one you're describing is the meat platter, which I think is the one that has like all the different, meats on it, which is probably honestly the one I'd eat. Because like the fish platter, I guess it sounds appealing too. But like the chef's choice looks fine. Again, I was just Googling this as well while you were talking, Garrett. So they look interesting. Again, I don't know if I like how much I'm like dying to eat these in real life, but it's cool that they have like this central food theme in the games, which again, just get when you eat food in the game, they give you some extra like stat buffs essentially when you're going to go out and hunt some of the monsters.
Yeah. And Monster Hunter Rise, it's little things called, I think they're called dongos, and they're just little treats. And that's the cutest cutscene as well. If you just look up on YouTube, Dongo Monster Hunter Rise cutscene, it's the cats and the little girl just making these dongos, and they actually shoot chopsticks into the puff pastry type of things. It's actually a really cool cutscene, so I would definitely eat that as well.
Meowsers, that's very exciting. All right, Garrett, before we go, we're gonna party up because we got a question, Garrett. I don't know if you've heard this question before.
Yes, we
did. From
did.
the Winner Gamer. He asks, what is your favorite RPG from every gaming system, both console and handheld? Of course, this has been an ongoing question, Garrett, but you know what? This is the last episode we're going to be talking about this question because we're finally at the end.
Yes.
So this week we're going to be talking about PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC, mobile are kind of all of our choices today. So we're going to kind of go back and forth again like we did before, talking about our favorite RPGs on each of these consoles. So, Garrett, I'm going to start with PS4.
Yes.
Persona 5 Royal for me, 100% slam dunk.
Okay.
There's no question about it for me in my book. Like it's kind of like when we talked about Persona 4 Golden on Vita being like kind of like the de facto choice for PlayStation Vita. For PlayStation 4, for me personally, there's no contest. There's no game that's even close to Persona 5 Royal in my books for the best RPG on PlayStation 4. And don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy 14, I've played a ton of it. It's a very close second place. But man, like those two in particular are just so much higher in my personal books than anything else on that console. But if I have to pick one, it's Persona 5 Royal by a landslide.
Okay.
Garrett, what do you think about PlayStation 4 in particular?
I would have to agree with you. I did not play Persona 5 Royal version of it, but base Persona 5 is probably my favorite RPG on the console itself. And it's not even a contest. I think the honorable mention for me, then another game that pops in my head for PS4 is Horizon Zero Dawn. I think that was a very solid third-person action RPG from Guerrilla. They did a fantastic job with it, and I can't wait for the sequel, for sure.
Yeah, honestly, Horizon is fantastic as well, and definitely a strong contender on those books as well. Again, PS4 believe it or not, with just the glut of games it got on, because there's over like 3,000 games on PS4.
Yeah.
There's a lot of RPGs to choose from, and definitely it was kind of like the de facto RPG console of this generation for sure. Because then we go over to Xbox One, Garrett, and this one's a little bit tougher to pick from because there's not, especially when you consider RPGs that are maybe exclusive or play better on Xbox. There just really aren't any, which is why, again, like I'm probably still going to go with a third-party pick for Xbox One. And that is actually, for me personally, Octopath Traveler is probably my favorite Xbox One RPG, which, again, it came out on Switch as well, but it's exclusive, at least for PS4 and Xbox One, exclusive to Xbox, believe it or not. So Octopath Traveler, really fantastic turn-based RPG. And again, this kind of goes back to what I talked about with Bravely Default on last week's episode. Like I liked it for the same reasons that I like Bravely Default, because again, it really reminded me of the Square Enix turn-based RPGs that I loved back on the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation 1. And it just had a fantastic story with 8 really likable characters, and they each had their own story, which was unique. Yes, by the end of the game, it felt like, okay, I just kind of want this to be over with by now. But I actually really enjoyed my time with Octopath Traveler. It's one of the only RPGs I played this generation that I beat twice, like beat more than once. So, because I played it and beat it on Switch, and then I played it again when it came to Xbox.
Oh, cool.
There, so
cool.
Octopath Traveler is my pick. Honorable mention would be Dragon Quest XI.
For sure.
Another game I really enjoyed, which again was a great game on Switch, but the frame rate was just so much smoother when you played it on Xbox.
I bet.
Again, just having it on Game Pass in particular really helped the game as well. And it was just a really enjoyable RPG. Again, another super long RPG on this list, but I had a lot of fun with Dragon Quest XI. And also, last honorable mention real quick would be, before I go to you, Garrett, was Crosscode. Was a game that I really enjoyed playing last year. Yes, it is more of like a Legend of Zelda type game, but it's also very much an action RPG at heart. And it was my favorite game from 2020, and I really enjoyed my time with Crosscode, and Xbox was probably the best way to play it because it was on Game Pass up until the time that this episode released, because it just left Game Pass now, but it's super, super fun. So, Garrett, what do you think about Xbox One?
I'm going to have to agree with you on the exclusive side of Xbox. There's really not much RPGs or really any RPGs out there or much choice of it. For me, the first game that popped up, and it's really games that you can argue that they're not RPGs, but they're games that have RPG elements. And I'm going to stick with that just because I don't mainly play my RPGs over in Xbox One or Series X land, other than now Bethesda games. But I'm going to go with Rise of the Tomb Raider, because I think they shouted that out as like a cool timed exclusive, very Xbox-centric game. And I really enjoyed the Tomb Raider series. I haven't played the Shadow one yet, but Rise was certainly my favorite of the two. And I love the mechanics of that as well. You do have a level up system. You do have some gear and exploration and everything. And there is a story. So you can argue it's a role-playing game, but you can also argue it's an action-adventure game as well. So yeah, my choice is
like
going to
very closely. I was just gonna say Tomb Raider is very close to being like a Metroidvania. Like that's what I think of most when I think about that. Like it
for sure,
because you're finding new items and upgrades to kind of go back to older areas that you've been to before and unlock those areas. Like that's what it reminded me most of. But it also has a lot of RPG elements as well. So you could actually qualify it as an action RPG as well, Garrett.
Yeah, and I'll shout out to Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Because, again, it's one of those games like, maybe it's a role-playing game if you think about it, but a lot of exploration in there as well. Sandboxy, go to objective. I think Syndicate, before the huge trifecta of Assassin's Creed games as of late, this was probably my favorite Assassin's Creed game of the franchise.
Syndicate was the game that actually really brought me back into Assassin's Creed, because I'd really fallen off after Assassin's Creed 2, and I loved Syndicate, and mainly it was because of like the RPG elements really helped get me into it, combined with the fact that you also had a grappling hook, which was just awesome to swing around kind of like old town London with a grappling hook was just So cool. So I also really love Syndicate. Like, I know a lot of people missed out on it because Unity was such a disappointment, and it's a shame too because Syndicate was a fantastic game, and it really, again, spurred on the RPG like Assassin's Creed games to kind of follow it, and it was kind of like the template that those games were kind of based off of. So yeah, Syndicate, really fantastic game. Also, I'm surprised you didn't say The Witcher 3 for either of these guys.
I'm saving that.
I think that would be a good point.
I'm saving it.
Oh,
yeah.
So let's talk about Switch, Garrett. What's your favorite Switch RPG?
Switch. For Switch, I really had to think about this because there's a lot of good long RPGs, but very short indie RPGs that I really enjoyed on the system. But the one that I think I played most of and really enjoyed was actually Wargroove. By Chucklefish. It is a advanced war type of style game where it is a tactics turn-based RPG, and you just create soldiers and cavalry and everything, and you face the enemy. And it's a grid-based system and very solid mechanics. It reminds me of, again, Advanced Wars, Final Fantasy Tactics, stuff like that. And then you have a commander that has a special power as well. Yeah, it reminds me of Age of Empires for DS as well, actually. But yeah, I think I wholeheartedly recommend this game for sure. And the difficulty is not like that great. It's pretty good because you have sliders instead of like, here's easy, medium, hard. It's like, no, what about like damage, or what about like traversal, or how much gold you get? There's actual sliders for them instead of like saying this is easy, medium, and hard. So I think it's a cute little tactical RPG, and it has a lot of character, a lot of soul into it. So yeah, I wholeheartedly recommend Wargroove.
I remember that game being really fun. Like, I remember playing it on Xbox Game Pass and just having a really fun time with it as well. Like, again, it really reminded, like you said, of Advanced Wars. So if you like Advanced Wars, you should definitely check it out. For me, I'm going to be boring with my pick, Garrett. I'm just going to say Fire Emblem Three Houses because I really dove down the deep end with that game and loved it. Like, I managed to play it with all the houses and just had like so much fun playing it. It's probably the game on Switch I've played the most because I think I have over 100 hours in Fire Emblem Three Houses. So
I think I do too.
Really enjoyed that game. And again, it's me also making up for me not picking a Fire Emblem game for 3DS when we talked about 3DS on last week's episode. So there's that. True. I have to redeem myself a little bit. Well, PC RPGs, Garrett. I think I know which one you're going to say here, but go ahead and say it.
It's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. And the reason why I saved it for PC is I think it's the most optimized on PC, at least with my current setup. Even with like a 1080 Ti GPU, you're going to get ultra graphics and unlimited frames. I think it's the most stable version versus Xbox and PlayStation. And also with Witcher, there's going to be a next-gen, current-gen upgrade to PS5 and Series X, and they're going to probably put in some ray tracing-enabled stuff in PC as well. So just keep on the lookout for that. But yeah, I just recommend Witcher 3 on PC. You can get on Steam, GOG. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
The fun part about that re-release, Garrett, is that on all the platforms, you're going to get Witcher Netflix DLC that's free for the game.
Yeah.
They announced that at WitcherCon last week from the time you guys are listening to this. So there you go. So The Witcher, again, I obviously knew you were going to go that direction. And PC, again, God, there's been so many like RPGs
there's so many good ones
on PC. Not only that coming from consoles, but also just CRPGs as well. That's kind of where they came from. Even though, again, I've never really been like a huge CRPG person, so that's definitely not my pick. But I'm going to rectify something I talked about when talking about PS4 games, Garrett. Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Aboard. Let's go. Yeah. My favorite PC role-playing game of all time. You better believe
Makes so much sense.
I mean, to be fair, my runner-up is World of Warcraft because I actually really love MMOs. Yeah. And I mean, PC is the place to play MMOs. Like if I want to play an RPG on PC, it's going to be an MMO. And World of Warcraft, I played it for years. I have over 365 days of playtime in World of Warcraft, Garrett, which is absurd. Like a whole year of my entire life has been spent playing World of Warcraft. And but I had so much fun with it. I met so many friends along the way, but it doesn't hold a candle to the experience that Final Fantasy XIV delivers. with its incredible story, cast of characters, as well as its incredible in-depth combat, its awesome boss design, as well as some fantastic music. I could just talk about Final Fantasy XIV all day, Garrett, because I love Final Fantasy XIV so much. But we're going to save more of that talk because we will be doing a Final Fantasy XIV episode. It's going to get its own dedicated episode when Endwalker comes out later this year. So later this fall, we will actually talk about Final Fantasy XIV for an entire episode. So get ready for that.
Nice.
And then last console, Garrett, which isn't really a console in a lot of ways, but I wanted to mention it here, mobile. Because mobile has RPGs on it. Do we like mobile RPGs at all, Garrett? Do you even have a favorite in this category?
I'm just going to say one game just because I know it's on mobile, but I don't play on mobile. And that's Genshin Impact. That's actually a very solid. I don't know if you call it a role-playing game. I guess it is. It is very much an action gacha game. But it's very solid. Very nice looking game, and it demands a lot on the mobile, but I'm going to just say Genshin Impact and be good.
Yeah. Honestly, with mobile, when I thought about this one, I was like, you could go one in two directions with it because, first of all, there's a lot of really good remakes of games on mobile. Whether you want to play any of the old Final Fantasy games or if you want to play Lunar, which I've talked about in the show many times, or a bunch of different Square Enix games. You can play almost every old Square Enix game on mobile because there's some kind of
so weird,
which is just the weirdest thing to see. But I'm going to go with a game built specifically for mobile, which is also a gacha game, but it's also an RPG technically. It's Fire Emblem Heroes because I played.
Yeah, Fire Emblem Heroes is solid, man. I love it.
It has its own campaign with its own set of characters that you can play as, but then you can also play just standard turn-based battles outside of that with the group of characters that you kind of accumulate with orbs, which is kind of where the gacha mechanics kind of come in. But you have characters from throughout the Fire Emblem series, and honestly, I had fun just playing the campaign just on its own, and I play that game pretty much every day, so I still play it a lot.
Wow.
So I'm going to go with Fire Emblem Heroes. I think it's actually a really solid choice. It's not like, Mario Kart Live or Utopia or some of Nintendo's other mobile endeavors where they just feel like kind of afterthoughts. Whereas this game it felt like it really translated the Fire Emblem experience well, while also just giving you kind of bite-sized doses of it rather than giving you this epic story and stuff like that. You don't have as much of that here, but it retains the gameplay from Fire Emblem in a really interesting way. So yeah, that's my pick for mobile. And then those are all the consoles we have. We're out of consoles at this point that we've played anyways, because again, we're not going to go and do Atari 2600, Garrett. We're not going to talk about the N-Gage or the Amiga CD32 or the 3DO or any of these consoles.
Never heard of it.
Sorry, Winter Gamer. This is as far as we go with your question. But I feel like over the last 4 episodes, Garrett, I feel like we've done Winter Gamer a great service, if I might say so myself.
Yes, definitely. That was a huge question, a loaded question, but I'm glad we stretched it out and really thought about it, for sure.
For sure. But Winter Gamer, if there's any consoles you want us to mention that we haven't mentioned here, feel free to reach out. But we won't read it on the show. But Garrett, that's all the time we have for this episode of the RPG. But before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Bland Explosion, and you can follow me at Twitch at twitch.tv/Bland Explosion whenever I stream. I'm also a co-host to the Nintendo Shack podcast from the Play Some Video Games Network. You can support there over at patreon.com/PSVG.
Very nice from a friend. As from you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You also find us on Twitter at the RPG Cave, as well as on YouTube. Just search for the RPG Cave there because we do have a video version of the show that goes up every week. If you want to see our beautiful and lovely faces, you can go look us up on YouTube as well. Patreon.com/UECapri is where you find our Patreon. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been level 9 of the RPG Cave, and we out.
Bye-bye.